Hello, my sleepy friends. Imagine the early morning air of the American frontier sometime in the 1840s. The sky is pale and wide above a vast open landscape, and the sun is only beginning to rise over endless grasslands. There are no cities here, no paved roads, no stores, no warm houses waiting nearby. Instead, there is only wind moving across the prairie, and the long wooden wagons of a traveling caravan preparing to begin another day of one of the hardest journeys in American history. This was the Oregon Trail, a migration route stretching more than 2,000 miles from the eastern frontier of the United States all the way to the distant valleys of Oregon. Thousands of settlers attempted this journey during the 19th century. Families sold their farms, packed their belongings into wooden wagons, and traveled west hoping for land, opportunity, and a better life. But the journey that looked hopeful on paper was often brutal in reality. If someone from the modern world suddenly stepped into that time and tried to survive a single day on the Oregon Trail, the experience would quickly reveal how demanding and exhausting the journey truly was. The day on the Oregon Trail began long before sunrise. Travelers rarely slept late because the entire caravan needed to move, while the weather remained cooler and the daylight was available. As the faint light of dawn spread across the prairie, the camps slowly came alive. Fires were rekindled from the coals of the night before, and families began preparing a simple breakfast. The meals were rarely luxurious. Most travelers ate basic foods such as hard bread, bacon, beans, or dried meat that had been packed before the journey began. Water was gathered from nearby rivers or streams whenever possible. Sometimes this water looked clear and refreshing, but many travelers understood that water sources could also carry illness. Still, on the frontier, there were few choices. The settlers drank what they could find and hoped it would be safe. While breakfast was being prepared, other members of the wagon party began organizing the animals that would pull the wagons for the day. Contrary to what many people imagine today, horses were not the most common animals used on the Oregon Trail. Many families relied on oxen because they were stronger, slower, and more capable of surviving the long journey. Oxen could pull heavy wagons across difficult terrain and required less expensive care than horses. Preparing the wagon animals each morning was serious work. Harnesses needed to be attached carefully, and the animals had to be guided into position before the wagons could begin moving. This process took time and patience, especially when large groups of travelers were preparing to depart at the same time. Once the caravan was ready, the wagons slowly began rolling across the open landscape. The creaking sound of wooden wheels against rough ground became one of the most familiar sounds of life on the trail. Dust rose into the air behind the wagons as they moved forward mile after mile. Travel on the Oregon Trail was rarely comfortable. The wagons themselves were not designed for smooth riding. Many settlers actually walked beside their wagons rather than sitting inside them. The interior of a wagon was usually filled with supplies, tools, and food needed for the journey, leaving little space for passengers. Walking beside the wagon for hours under the open sky quickly became exhausting. The ground was uneven, sometimes muddy, sometimes rocky, and the weather could change quickly. During summer months, the sun beat down on the travelers with intense heat, while sudden storms could bring heavy rain or strong winds. Despite these difficulties, the wagon trains continued moving westward day after day. The travelers understood that stopping too often could delay the journey and increase the risk of running out of supplies before reaching Oregon. Along the trail, the landscape changed constantly. The travelers crossed wide plains, followed winding rivers, and slowly approached the distant mountains that marked the western edge of the continent. To many settlers, these views were breathtaking, yet the beauty of the land did not reduce the difficulty of the journey. For people living today, it can be difficult to imagine just how physically demanding this travel was. The Oregon Trail was not a short adventure. It was a months-long test of endurance that required constant work, patience, and resilience. And this was only the beginning of a typical day on the Oregon Trail. As the wagons continued moving across the prairie, the challenges of the journey were only just beginning to reveal themselves. As the wagons continued moving across the endless prairie, the reality of life on the Oregon Trail became clearer with every mile. The journey west was not a smooth adventure or a simple road trip across open land. It was a long and exhausting test of endurance that demanded constant physical effort from nearly everyone in the wagon train. The early excitement many travelers felt when they first began the journey often faded quickly once they experienced the daily labor required simply to keep moving forward. After the morning departure from camp, the wagons traveled slowly across the open plains. Oxen pulled the heavy loads at a steady but very slow pace, usually moving only a few miles each hour. The goal of most wagon trains was to cover around 15 miles in a full day of travel, though this depended heavily on the terrain and weather conditions. Some days the group managed to travel farther, but many days progress was slower because of rough ground or unexpected obstacles. Most travelers did not sit comfortably inside their wagons during these long hours. The wagons were filled with essential supplies such as food, tools, clothing, spare parts, and sometimes small furniture pieces from the family's homes. Because space was limited, adults and older children often walked beside the wagons rather than riding inside them. This meant that settlers spent long hours each day walking across uneven ground under the open sky. The physical toll of this constant walking was enormous. Travelers faced heat, dust, wind, and rough terrain throughout the day. Their shoes wore down quickly on the rocky paths, and many settlers found themselves walking with sore feet and aching muscles after only a few days on the trail. Yet stopping frequently was not an option, because the wagon train needed to maintain steady progress toward the west. Food during the day was extremely simple. Large cooking breaks were usually saved for the evening when the wagons stopped for the night. During the daytime hours, travelers often relied on small snacks they carried with them. Hard biscuits, dried meat, or pieces of bread were eaten while walking beside the wagons. These foods were not exciting, but they were easy to carry and could survive long journeys without spoiling. Water remained one of the most important concerns for travelers on the trail. Wagon trains tried to follow rivers and streams whenever possible, because these sources provided drinking water for both people and animals. However, not every water source was clean or safe. Stagnant water could carry illness, and some rivers were difficult to cross safely. Despite the risks, settlers often had no choice but to rely on whatever water they could find along the route. Crossing rivers was one of the most dangerous parts of the journey. Bridges rarely existed on the frontier, which meant wagon trains needed to find shallow sections of rivers where the wagons could be guided through the water. Sometimes the wagons were partially unloaded to make them lighter, and the animals were carefully guided across the current. Even with these precautions, accidents sometimes occurred, and wagons could tip or become stuck in the riverbed. Throughout the day, the wagon train remained alert to potential dangers on the trail. Contrary to many popular stories, attacks from hostile groups were not the most common threat. Instead, illness, exhaustion, and accidents posed much greater risks to travelers. Diseases such as cholera spread quickly among wagon trains during certain years, especially when large numbers of settlers used the same water sources along the trail. The weather also created constant challenges. The plains of the American West were known for sudden changes in conditions. A calm morning could quickly turn into a windy afternoon, filled with dust blowing across the landscape. Storms sometimes appeared with little warning, bringing heavy rain or lightning that forced wagon trains to stop temporarily until conditions improved. Despite all these difficulties, the settlers continued pushing westward. The promise of land and opportunity in Oregon kept many travelers motivated, even during the hardest moments of the journey. Families encouraged one another to keep moving, knowing that turning back would mean abandoning the dreams that had brought them onto the trail in the first place. As the sun slowly climbed higher into the sky, the wagon train continued its steady movement across the vast prairie. Dust followed the wagons as they rolled forward mile after mile, and the travelers walked beside them with determination despite the fatigue building in their legs. By midday, the heat often became intense, and the long hours of walking began to take their toll on the settlers. Yet the day on the Oregon Trail was far from over, and many more challenges still waited ahead before the wagons could finally stop for the night. As the wagon train pushed deeper into the day's journey, the bright morning air slowly turned into the heavy warmth of the afternoon sun. The open plains of the American frontier offered very little shelter from the weather. There were no trees lining the road, no buildings where travelers could rest, and no shade except the narrow shadows cast by the wagons themselves. The settlers moving westward quickly discovered that the Oregon Trail demanded patience, endurance, and a great deal of physical strength. By the middle of the day, the travelers had usually been walking for several hours already. Their pace remained slow but steady because the oxen pulling the wagons could not be rushed. These animals were chosen for their strength and reliability rather than speed. Each wagon creaked and groaned as it rolled across uneven ground, the wooden wheels turning slowly through dirt, grass, and sometimes rocky patches of land that made the journey even more difficult. Dust became one of the constant companions of the travelers. As the wagons moved across dry ground, clouds of fine prairie dust rose into the air behind them. This dust settled onto clothing, hair, food supplies, and nearly everything else the settlers carried. By the afternoon, many travelers found themselves covered in a thin layer of dust that clung to their skin and made the journey even more uncomfortable. Despite the exhaustion, the wagon train could not stop frequently. Time mattered greatly on the Oregon Trail because the entire journey needed to be completed before winter arrived in the mountains of the West. If travelers moved too slowly and were caught by early snow in the Rocky Mountains or the Cascade Range, the consequences could be deadly. Because of this danger, wagon trains tried to maintain steady daily progress whenever possible. Along the route, the settlers often followed well-known landmarks that helped guide their journey westward. One of the most famous of these landmarks was Chimney Rock, a tall natural rock formation rising high above the plains of present-day Nebraska. For travelers who had spent weeks crossing endless flat land, seeing Chimney Rock appear on the horizon brought a sense of progress and encouragement. Another well-known point along the trail was Scotts Bluff, a massive rock formation that stood like a natural gateway through the plains. Wagon trains often passed near this landmark as they continued moving toward the distant mountains that marked the western half of the journey. These landmarks were more than just interesting sights. They served as navigation points that reassured travelers they were still following the correct path toward Oregon. Maps during this time were not always accurate, and many settlers depended on guidebooks or the experience of earlier travelers to find their way. The animals pulling the wagons also needed careful attention throughout the day. Oxen required regular breaks for water and grazing whenever suitable grass could be found. If the animals became too weak or injured, the wagon could no longer continue the journey. Because of this, many travelers paid close attention to the condition of their animals, sometimes stopping briefly to adjust harnesses or allow the oxen to rest. While the wagons continued moving, some settlers walked ahead of the train, scouting the trail for obstacles. The path was not always smooth. Deep ruts left by earlier wagons could make travel difficult, and sudden dips in the land sometimes forced travelers to guide their wagons carefully down steep slopes or across small streams. Children traveling with the wagon trains experienced the journey differently from the adults. While their parents focused on the hard work of keeping the wagons moving, children sometimes walked beside the trail, observing the unfamiliar landscape around them. They saw vast herds of bison grazing in the distance, small prairie animals darting through the grass, and enormous skies stretching across the horizon without interruption. Yet even for children, the long journey could become exhausting. The endless walking and the harsh weather conditions quickly drained their energy. Many families tried to rotate who rode inside the wagons so younger children could rest, while others walked beside the train. By late afternoon, the entire wagon train often showed signs of fatigue. The travelers had been moving for most of the day under the open sky, and the physical effort required to maintain the journey weighed heavily on their bodies. Still, the wagons continued forward because reaching a suitable campsite before nightfall was essential. Eventually, the leader of the wagon train would begin searching for a place where the travelers could stop for the evening. The ideal campsite needed access to water, enough grass for the animals to graze, and open space where the wagons could gather safely for the night. As the sun slowly began lowering toward the western horizon, the wagon train prepared to end another long day on the Oregon Trail. Yet even when the wagons finally stopped moving, the work of survival on the frontier was far from finished. As the long afternoon slowly faded and the sun began lowering toward the distant western horizon, the wagon train finally prepared to stop for the evening. After a full day of walking, guiding animals, and moving the heavy wagons across miles of rough land, the settlers looked forward to the moment when the wheels would finally stop turning. Yet even this moment of relief did not mean that the day's work was finished. In many ways, the evening hours on the Oregon Trail required just as much effort as the long march across the prairie. When the leader of the wagon train found a suitable location, the wagons were slowly guided into position to form a loose circle or line. This arrangement helped keep the group organized and made it easier to gather everyone together during the night. Contrary to many popular stories, the wagons were not always arranged in a perfect defensive circle like those shown in movies. Most of the time, the wagons were simply positioned in a way that allowed easy access to supplies while keeping the animals close by. The first task after stopping was always caring for the animals. The oxen that had pulled the wagons all day needed water and time to graze. Travelers carefully removed the heavy harnesses from the animals and guided them toward nearby grass or water sources if they were available. Without strong animals, the journey could not continue, so settlers treated them with great care despite their own exhaustion. While some members of the group handled the animals, others immediately began preparing the evening meal. Cooking on the Oregon Trail was simple, but required effort. Fires had to be built using whatever wood or dry grass could be found nearby. On the open plains, trees were sometimes scarce, which meant travelers often had to collect small pieces of brush or use dried animal dung as fuel for their cooking fires. Once the fire was ready, cooking pots were placed over the flames and the evening meal began to take shape. The food available on the trail was usually basic and repetitive. Beans, bacon, flour, dried meat, and coffee formed the core of many meals. Sometimes travelers prepared stews by mixing dried foods together with water and allowing the mixture to cook slowly over the fire. Bread was also a common part of the evening meal. Many settlers carried flour with them and used simple methods to bake bread or biscuits in cast-iron cookware. The smell of fresh bread drifting through the campsite could bring comfort after a long and exhausting day of travel. While the food cooked, families gathered near the fires to rest their tired legs. Boots were removed, sore feet were rubbed, and travelers stretched their aching muscles after hours of walking beside the wagons. The prairie air often cooled quickly after sunset, and many settlers welcomed the warmth of the cooking fires as darkness approached. Evenings on the trail also provided one of the few opportunities for social interaction among the travelers. After spending most of the day walking in silence beside the wagons, settlers often used the evening hours to talk with neighbors in the wagon train. Stories were shared about the progress of the journey, the conditions of the trail ahead, and the landmarks that had been passed during the day. Some travelers spoke about the homes they had left behind in the eastern states or in Europe. Others discussed the fertile land they hoped to find in Oregon, imagining farms, houses, and new communities that might be built once the long journey finally ended. Children sometimes played near the wagons while their parents prepared the evening meal. For them, the wide-open prairie felt like an enormous playground filled with unfamiliar sights. They chased each other through the grass, collected small stones or feathers, and watched the animals grazing nearby. Yet even during these quieter moments, the travelers remained aware of the challenges surrounding them. The wilderness of the American frontier could be unpredictable. Wild animals roamed the plains, and sudden weather changes were always possible. Because of this, many wagon trains kept watch during the night to ensure the safety of both people and animals. As darkness slowly covered the prairie, the evening meal was finally shared among the travelers. Sitting around the fire with simple food in their hands, settlers experienced one of the few peaceful moments of the day. The sky above them stretched wide and clear, often filled with countless stars that seemed brighter than any seen in the crowded cities of the East. But even as the travelers rested beside the fires, everyone understood that another demanding day on the Oregon Trail would begin again with the first light of dawn. As night slowly settled across the wide prairie, the campfires of the wagon train burned softly against the darkness. After the long hours of walking beside wagons, guiding oxen, and enduring the harsh sun of the frontier, the travelers finally had a few quiet moments to sit and rest. The vast American sky stretched endlessly above them, filled with bright stars that seemed far clearer than anything most of the settlers had ever seen back in towns and villages of the eastern states or Europe. Yet even these peaceful moments carried a certain tension, because life on the Oregon Trail never truly allowed travelers to relax completely. The frontier was unpredictable, and survival required constant awareness. While families finished their meals beside the fires, Some members of the wagon train began preparing for the responsibilities that came with nightfall. One of the most important tasks was securing the animals. The oxen that had pulled the wagons throughout the day needed to remain close to the camp so they could be gathered again in the morning. Travelers often tied them together with ropes or guided them into grazing areas nearby where someone could watch them during the night. Losing an ox could mean losing the ability to move a wagon, which would place an entire family in serious danger along the trail. Because of this risk, many wagon trains organized a rotating watch system during the night. Different men from the group took turns staying awake to watch over the animals in the campsite while others slept. These night guards walked quietly around the camp, listening for unusual sounds and making sure the animals did not wander too far into the darkness. Meanwhile, most families began preparing their sleeping arrangements. Contrary to popular belief, many travelers did not sleep inside their wagons. The wagons were filled tightly with supplies needed for the journey, leaving very little space for comfortable rest. Instead, settlers often slept on the ground beside the wagons using blankets or simple bedding they had carried with them. Sleeping outdoors exposed travelers to the changing conditions of the frontier night. Temperatures on the plains could drop quickly after sunset, especially during early spring or late autumn journeys. Travelers wrapped themselves in blankets and coats to stay warm while the wind moved across the open land. The sounds of the prairie became more noticeable during these quiet hours. The crackling of campfires mixed with the distant calls of animals and the gentle rustling of grass moving in the night breeze. For settlers who had lived most of their lives in towns or villages, the vast silence of the frontier could feel both peaceful and unsettling at the same time. Illness remained a constant concern during these long journeys. Diseases such as cholera had devastated many wagon trains during the peak years of migration along the Oregon Trail. The illness spread quickly through contaminated water sources and poor sanitation along the route. Travelers sometimes went to sleep at night worried about the health of family members who had fallen ill during the day. Medical knowledge at the time was limited, and most wagon trains carried only basic supplies such as bandages, simple medicines, and herbal remedies. If someone became seriously sick or injured, there were very few options for treatment. The nearest town or doctor could be hundreds of miles away. Despite these dangers, the settlers continued pushing forward day after day, because turning back was often impossible. By the time a wagon train reached the Central Plains of America, they had already traveled too far to return easily to their starting point. The only realistic path was forward toward the distant valleys of Oregon. As the night grew deeper, the camp gradually became quiet. Families settled into their blankets beside the wagons. Children drifted into sleep after the long day of travel, and the campfires slowly burned down to glowing embers. The guards walking the perimeter of the campsite remained awake beneath the vast sky, watching over the animals and listening carefully to the silent prairie surrounding them. In only a few short hours, the first light of dawn would return, and the entire process of survival on the Oregon Trail would begin again. Long before the sun returned to the horizon, the quiet prairie camp slowly began to stir again. The night watchmen who had guarded the animals during the dark hours were usually the first to notice the faint light appearing in the east. A cold wind often moved across the grasslands in the early morning, and the travelers wrapped their coats tighter around themselves as they prepared to begin another demanding day on the Oregon Trail. Sleeping on the open ground rarely provided the deep rest that modern travelers might expect. The hard earth, the constant wind, and the sounds of animals moving through the darkness made sleep lighter and shorter than many settlers were used to. When morning came, most travelers woke with stiff muscles and tired legs from the long walk they had completed the day before. Despite their exhaustion, the wagon train could not afford to delay. The journey across the continent required discipline and constant progress. Every morning, the travelers repeated the same routine that had become essential to survival on the trail. The first task was waking the entire camp. Families slowly rose from their blankets and began preparing the morning fire once again. Small cooking fires were built using whatever fuel could be gathered nearby. On the plains, where trees were scarce, travelers often relied on dried brush or buffalo chips, which were hardened pieces of animal dung that burned surprisingly well as fuel. Breakfast was usually simple and quick. Time was valuable on the trail, and the wagon train needed to begin moving as early as possible while the air remained cool. Many settlers ate basic foods such as fried bacon, beans, hard bread, or leftover biscuits from the previous evening. Coffee was a common drink during these early mornings, and many travelers valued it greatly because it helped them face another day of hard work ahead. While some members of the family prepared breakfast, others began organizing the animals that would pull the wagons. Oxen were often scattered across nearby grass during the night, so they needed to be gathered again before the journey could continue. This task required patience and sometimes a great deal of effort, especially when animals wandered farther away from the camp than expected. Once the oxen were found, the harnesses had to be carefully attached again. The heavy wooden yokes were placed across the animals' shoulders, and the leather straps connecting them to the wagons were tightened securely. This process required coordination between several people to ensure the animals were properly positioned before the wagons began moving. Meanwhile, the rest of the camp worked quickly to pack their belongings back into the wagons. Blankets were rolled, cooking pots were cleaned and stored, and any loose supplies were secured so they would not fall during the day's travel. The wagons had to remain tightly organized because every item carried across the trail served an important purpose. By the time the sun finally rose above the prairie, the wagon train was often ready to move once again. The long line of covered wagons slowly began rolling forward, their white canvas tops glowing in the early morning light. The creaking sound of wooden wheels returned as the wagons moved across the land, and the familiar cloud of dust followed behind them. The settlers resumed their positions beside the wagons, beginning another long walk across the frontier. Some travelers carried walking sticks to help support their tired legs, while others simply kept moving step by step beside the animals pulling the heavy loads. The landscape ahead stretched endlessly across the plains. Rolling grasslands reached toward distant horizons, where the sky met the earth in a thin blue line. Occasionally, travelers spotted wildlife moving through the prairie. Herds of bison sometimes appeared far in the distance, and smaller animals darted through the tall grass as the wagon train passed. Despite the beauty of the land, the journey remained physically demanding. The settlers knew that every mile required effort, patience, and determination. Each step forward brought them closer to the distant mountains that marked the next stage of their long migration westward. And so the wagon train continued once again, moving slowly but steadily across the vast frontier, repeating the same exhausting routine that defined life on the Oregon Trail. As the morning sun climbed higher over the endless prairie, the wagon train settled once again into the long rhythm of movement that defined life on the Oregon Trail. The travelers walked beside their wagons step after step, hour after hour, while the oxen pulled the heavy wooden loads slowly across the uneven ground. From a distance, the line of covered wagons looked almost peaceful, moving steadily through the wide landscape beneath an enormous sky. But for the settlers themselves, each mile demanded effort, patience, and physical endurance that most people today would struggle to match. The terrain along the trail was rarely smooth. Although parts of the route followed relatively open plains, the land often contained deep wagon ruts left by earlier travelers. These grooves in the ground had been carved by thousands of wagons over many years, and they could become extremely difficult to cross. When the wheels of a wagon slipped into a deep rut, the animals pulling it sometimes struggled to climb back out again. Travelers often had to stop briefly and help guide the wagon forward so it would not tip or become stuck. Rivers and streams continued to appear along the route, and each crossing presented another challenge for the wagon train. Some rivers were shallow enough for the wagons to pass through directly, but others required careful planning before attempting the crossing. If the water moved too quickly or the riverbed was too deep, wagons could become unstable and risk overturning. In certain places, travelers chose to unload part of their supplies before crossing the river, so the wagon would be lighter. The animals were then carefully guided through the water, while several members of the group held the wagon steady. After reaching the opposite bank, the supplies were loaded again before the journey continued. These crossings slowed progress and required cooperation from everyone involved. Throughout the day, travelers kept a close eye on the condition of their animals. Oxen were incredibly strong, but they could also become exhausted after pulling heavy wagons for many hours. If an animal became injured or too weak to continue, the entire wagon could be left behind. Because of this risk, settlers often paused briefly during the day to allow the oxen to drink water or graze on the grass growing along the trail. Wildlife was a common sight across the plains. Bison herds sometimes appeared in the distance, their massive shapes moving slowly across the prairie grass. For settlers who had never seen such animals before, the sight could be both exciting and intimidating. Although bison generally avoided wagon trains, their presence reminded travelers that they were crossing lands where nature still ruled the landscape. The weather continued to shape the experience of the journey as well. Some afternoons brought calm skies and warm sunlight that made the trail easier to travel. Other days brought powerful winds sweeping across the plains, sending clouds of dust into the air that made breathing and seeing difficult. When storms appeared suddenly on the horizon, wagon trains sometimes hurried to secure their supplies before the rain arrived. Despite all these challenges, the wagon train moved forward with steady determination. Each traveler understood that the journey required persistence. The distance to Oregon stretched for thousands of miles, and every small section of progress mattered. By the time the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the travelers had usually been walking for many hours already. Their legs ached from the effort, their clothes were covered in dust, and the weight of the long journey pressed heavily on their bodies. Yet the wagons continued rolling forward because stopping too early meant losing valuable daylight needed to reach the next campsite. And so, beneath the blazing afternoon sun, the long line of wagons pushed onward across the vast frontier, carrying hundreds of hopeful settlers toward the distant western lands they had risked everything to reach. As the wagon train continued pressing forward across the vast western plains, the afternoon hours slowly became the hardest part of the entire day. By this point, the settlers had already walked many miles since sunrise, and the weight of the long journey began to show in their movements. Their steps became slower, their shoulders heavier, and the quiet determination that pushed them forward was often the only thing keeping the wagon train moving toward the distant west. The sun hanging high above the prairie could become relentless during these afternoon hours. Without trees or buildings to provide shade, the travelers were fully exposed to the heat. The canvas tops of the wagons offered only limited shelter, and most adults continued walking beside the wagons rather than riding inside them. Their clothing, often made of heavy fabrics suited for long travel, trapped heat against their bodies as they moved across the dry land. Dust remained one of the constant challenges of the Oregon Trail. With every turn of the wagon wheels, clouds of dry soil rose into the air and followed the travelers along the path. The dust settled onto their clothes, into their hair, and sometimes even into their food supplies. Many settlers covered their mouths with cloth to avoid breathing too much of the fine powder that filled the air behind the moving wagons. The long journey also tested the strength of the wagons themselves. These wooden vehicles had been built to carry heavy loads across rough land, but the trail was unforgiving. Wheels sometimes cracked under the pressure of rocks and ruts in the ground. Axles could break after weeks of constant use. When something like this happened, the wagon train had to stop while the problem was repaired. Many travelers carried spare tools and wooden parts specifically for this purpose. Men in the wagon train often worked together to repair damaged wheels or reinforce weakened sections of the wagons. These repairs were not easy, especially under the hot sun of the plains, but they were necessary if the journey was going to continue. The trail itself gradually began changing as the wagon train moved farther west. The endless grasslands of the Central Plains slowly gave way to rougher terrain. Hills appeared more frequently, and the land began rising toward the distant mountains that marked the next major challenge of the journey. Traveling uphill with a heavy wagon was far more difficult than crossing the flat plains. Oxen strained against their harnesses as they pulled the wagon slowly upward, their powerful muscles working hard with every step. Sometimes settlers had to push the wagons from behind, or walk beside the animals, guiding them carefully along narrow paths. Despite these challenges, the settlers continued moving forward because they understood the importance of reaching the mountains before winter arrived. Snowfall in the Rocky Mountains could block the trail completely, trapping wagon trains in dangerous conditions if they had not already crossed the region. The hours passed slowly as the wagon train continued its steady movement across the land. Travelers focused on placing one foot in front of the other while keeping pace with the wagons. Some settlers walked quietly, lost in their thoughts, while others spoke softly with companions about the journey ahead. Occasionally, someone would climb a small rise along the trail and look out across the landscape behind them. The long line of wagons stretched across the prairie like a moving caravan, each wagon carrying a family's belongings and hopes for the future. By late afternoon, the sunlight began softening again as the sun moved closer to the horizon. The travelers knew that soon the leader of the wagon train would begin searching for another suitable place to stop for the night. Everyone looked forward to that moment when the wagons would finally come to rest after another exhausting day on the Oregon Trail. Yet even as the day slowly drew toward its end, the settlers understood that tomorrow would bring the same routine once again. Another sunrise, another long walk beside the wagons, and another stretch of the endless trail leading toward Oregon. As the long afternoon slowly began turning toward evening, the wagon train continued its steady progress across the frontier. The golden light of the lowering sun stretched across the prairie, casting long shadows behind the wagons as they rolled forward through the tall grass. By this point in the day, Nearly everyone traveling along the Oregon Trail felt the deep exhaustion that came from hours of walking and working beneath the open sky. The settlers had often been moving since before sunrise, and the physical strain of the journey became more noticeable with every passing mile. Legs felt heavy, shoulders ached, and the dry prairie wind had left many travelers thirsty and tired. Still, the wagons kept moving because the group needed to reach a suitable campsite before darkness arrived. Finding the right place to stop was important for survival on the trail. The leaders of the wagon train looked for areas where fresh water could be found nearby. Rivers, streams, or springs were ideal because both people and animals needed reliable water sources after the long day of travel. In addition to water, the settlers also needed grass where the oxen could graze during the night. As the wagon train approached a good location, the call to stop slowly moved down the line of travelers. One wagon after another began slowing its pace until finally the entire train came to rest on the open prairie. The sudden quiet after hours of moving wheels and walking footsteps often felt like a relief to the exhausted travelers. But just like every evening before, stopping the wagons did not mean the work of the day was finished. The settlers immediately began preparing the campsite so that the group could rest safely through the night. Wagons were carefully arranged again, sometimes forming a loose circle or line that helped keep everyone organized in one place. The animals were once again the first priority. The oxen that had pulled the wagons all day needed to be unharnessed and allowed to rest. Heavy wooden yokes were removed from their shoulders, and the animals were guided toward nearby grass where they could eat. Water was brought to them if a river or stream was close enough to reach. While some members of the wagon train cared for the animals, others began gathering materials for the evening fires. On the open plains, this task was often more difficult than expected because wood was not always easy to find. Travelers sometimes collected small branches, dried brush, or buffalo chips to use as fuel for cooking. Once the fires were burning, cooking began again just as it had every evening of the journey. The meals remained simple and familiar. Beans, bacon, dried meat, and biscuits formed the foundation of many dinners along the trail. Cooking pots were placed over the flames while families gathered nearby, resting their tired legs while waiting for the food to be ready. As darkness slowly spread across the prairie, the campsite came alive with quiet conversation. After spending most of the day walking in silence beside their wagons, settlers often used the evening hours to talk with one another. They shared stories about the progress of the journey, discussed landmarks they had passed during the day, and sometimes spoke about the hopes that had brought them onto the trail in the first place. Children played near the wagons while the adults prepared food. The wide prairie offered endless space for their imagination, though the long journey could still be tiring for them as well. Many children quickly fell asleep after dinner, wrapped in blankets beside the wagons while the campfires flickered softly in the night air. Above the campsite, the sky slowly filled with stars. Without the lights of cities or towns, the night sky of the frontier appeared incredibly bright. Travelers often looked upward while resting beside the fires, seeing the vastness of the sky stretching above the endless plains. Yet despite the beauty of these quiet moments, the settlers knew the journey was far from easy. The Oregon Trail demanded strength, patience, and determination every single day. For modern travelers used to comfort and convenience, even one full day of this routine would feel overwhelming. And as the campfires slowly faded into glowing embers, the settlers prepared themselves for another night of rest before the difficult journey would begin again with the first light of morning. As darkness settled fully over the prairie and the last colors of sunset disappeared beyond the horizon, the wagon train slowly grew quiet. The long and exhausting day of travel had drained nearly everyone in the camp. The fires that had been used for cooking now burned lower, casting small circles of warm light across the ground while the rest of the prairie stretched away into deep darkness. For the settlers traveling along the Oregon Trail, night was both a time of rest and a time of caution. The wide frontier was not an empty place. The land was alive with sounds that could seem strange and unsettling to travelers who had spent most of their lives in towns or villages far to the east. Coyotes called across the plains in the distance, and the wind moved through the grass in long, whispering waves. Families finished their meals and began preparing to sleep beside their wagons. Blankets were spread on the ground, sometimes beneath the wagons where the wooden frames offered a small amount of shelter from the wind. Many travelers preferred sleeping outside rather than inside the wagons because the wagons were tightly packed with supplies and offered very little space for comfortable rest. Children were usually the first to fall asleep. After a full day of walking beside the wagons or riding briefly when space allowed, their energy was gone. Parents tucked them into blankets while the last conversations of the evening faded around the campfires. Adults, however, often remained awake a little longer. Sitting beside the glowing embers of the fire, they spoke quietly about the journey. Some talked about the miles they had already traveled since leaving Missouri weeks earlier. Others discussed the trail ahead and the challenges that still waited before they could reach the valleys of Oregon. The Oregon Trail was not simply a path across the land. It was a months-long migration across an entire continent. The journey stretched for more than 2,000 miles, crossing rivers, plains, deserts, and mountains. Every wagon carried the possessions of a family who had decided to risk everything in pursuit of a new life in the West. Many settlers had sold nearly all their belongings before beginning the journey. They had packed only the supplies they believed would help them survive the long trip. Flour, beans, bacon, dried meat, coffee, spare wagon parts, tools, clothing, and bedding filled the wagons from end to end. Every item had to justify the space it occupied, because once the wagon train left the frontier towns behind, there were no stores where missing supplies could be replaced. Even small mistakes in planning could create serious problems. If a family brought too little food, they risked running out before reaching Oregon. If they packed too much weight into the wagon, the animals pulling it could become exhausted long before the journey was finished. Because of these risks, settlers constantly worried about the balance between preparation and survival. Around the campfires in the evening, they sometimes discussed the wagons that had already been abandoned along the trail. Broken wagons and discarded furniture could be found in certain places where earlier travelers had been forced to lighten their loads in order to continue moving west. As the night deepened, most travelers eventually lay down to rest beneath the open sky. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, and above their heads the stars shone with remarkable brightness. Without the lights of cities, the night sky of the frontier appeared vast and almost overwhelming. Yet even during sleep, the settlers remained aware that the journey was far from easy. Many wagon trains had lost members along the trail to illness, accidents, or exhaustion. Cholera outbreaks during the migration years had taken thousands of lives. Graves sometimes appeared beside the trail, simple markers reminding travelers of how dangerous the journey could be. Still, The wagon trains continued moving west year after year because the promise of new land and opportunity was powerful enough to draw thousands of families onto the trail. And as the quiet prairie night surrounded the campsite, the settlers slept knowing that only a few hours later, the first light of dawn would return again, bringing with it another demanding day on the Oregon Trail. As the long prairie night slowly moved toward morning, the campsite of the wagon train rested beneath a sky still filled with stars. The fires that had burned earlier in the evening were now mostly reduced to faint red embers glowing softly in the darkness. Most travelers were asleep on the ground beside their wagons, wrapped in blankets and coats to protect themselves from the cool air that often settled over the plains during the night. But even during these quiet hours, the Oregon Trail never truly became completely still. Somewhere near the edge of the campsite, one of the night guards continued walking slowly through the darkness. Wagon trains often assigned men to remain awake in shifts during the night so the animals would not wander too far from camp. Oxen were valuable and essential for the journey. If a wagon lost its animals, the family traveling with it could quickly find themselves stranded on the trail with no way to move forward. The guard walked quietly among the wagons, occasionally listening for unusual sounds or watching the animals grazing in the distance. Sometimes the wind moving through the tall prairie grass created long waves that rustled across the land, like the sound of distant water. To travelers unfamiliar with the frontier, these noises could seem mysterious or even unsettling. Eventually, the eastern horizon began to show the faintest hint of light. The stars slowly faded, and the long prairie night began giving way to another day on the Oregon Trail. The guard might add fresh wood or brush to one of the dying campfires so the flames could return to life and warm the cold morning air. Soon the first travelers began waking from their restless sleep. Blankets were folded, coats were pulled tighter against the morning chill, and the slow routine of preparing the wagon train for another day began once again. Cooking fires were rebuilt using small branches, dry grass, or buffalo chips gathered nearby. The smell of smoke drifted across the campsite as families prepared another simple breakfast before the journey continued. Food supplies were always used carefully because travelers needed their provisions to last for many months. Most breakfasts remained simple and practical. Bacon might be fried in a pan over the fire while biscuits or bread warmed nearby. Coffee was brewed in metal pots, its strong aroma filling the cool air of the campsite. For many settlers, that morning cup of coffee was one of the few comforts that remained constant throughout the difficult journey. While breakfast was prepared, other members of the wagon train went searching for the animals that had been grazing during the night. Oxen were often scattered across nearby patches of grass, and gathering them again required time and patience. Travelers walked across the prairie, calling to the animals and guiding them back toward the wagons. Once the oxen were brought together, the heavy wooden yokes were placed carefully across their shoulders again. Leather straps connected the animals to the wagon tongues, and the harnesses were tightened so the teams could pull the wagons once the caravan began moving again. Meanwhile, the rest of the families packed their belongings back into the wagons. Blankets were rolled, cooking utensils were cleaned and stored, and loose items were secured so they would not fall during the long day of travel ahead. The process repeated itself every morning of the journey, creating a rhythm that slowly became part of daily life for the settlers. Though the work was exhausting, the routine helped the travelers stay organized while crossing thousands of miles of wilderness. By the time the sun finally rose over the prairie, the wagon train was often nearly ready to depart. The early light illuminated the white canvas covers stretched over the wagons, and the line of travelers slowly formed once again. With a few quiet commands to the animals, the wagon wheels began turning again across the trail. The creaking wood, the steady footsteps of travelers walking beside the wagons, and the distant sound of animals moving through the grass all returned as the caravan continued its long journey toward the distant west. As the sun rose higher over the vast American frontier, the wagon train once again settled into the steady rhythm that defined life on the Oregon Trail. The long line of covered wagons slowly stretched across the prairie, their white canvas tops glowing softly under the growing light of the morning. Dust began rising again beneath the turning wheels, forming a thin cloud that followed the travelers as they moved steadily westward. For the settlers walking beside the wagons, the early morning hours were often the most comfortable part of the day. The air remained cool, and the sun had not yet reached the intense heat that would arrive later in the afternoon. Many travelers tried to cover as much distance as possible during these early hours while conditions were still manageable. The wagons moved at the same slow and reliable pace they had followed since the beginning of the journey. Oxen pulled the heavy loads forward step by step, their powerful muscles working steadily beneath the wooden yokes that connected them to the wagons. Unlike horses, oxen were not fast animals, but their strength and endurance made them far better suited for the long and demanding trip across the continent. Walking beside the wagons remained the daily reality for most settlers. The inside of the wagon was usually packed tightly with supplies that had been carefully chosen before leaving the frontier towns. Large barrels of flour, sacks of beans, tools for repairing wagons, spare clothing, cooking pots, and bedding filled nearly every available space. Because of this, adults and older children spent much of the journey on foot rather than riding. The physical strain of this routine became clearer as the journey continued day after day. Travelers often walked 10 to 15 miles each day across uneven ground. Their boots wore down quickly, and many settlers wrapped cloth around their feet or repaired their shoes whenever possible to avoid injury. The trail itself was not always easy to follow. Although thousands of wagons had already passed along the Oregon Trail during previous years, weather and time sometimes erased sections of the path. Travelers relied on guidebooks, landmarks, and the experience of others in the wagon train to stay on the correct route. Landmarks played an important role in helping settlers understand their progress. Tall rock formations rising from the plains could often be seen from many miles away. These natural features served as signposts guiding travelers westward across the otherwise endless grasslands. One of the most famous landmarks along the trail was Chimney Rock, a tall, narrow rock tower that rose dramatically above the surrounding plains in what is now Nebraska. For many settlers, seeing Chimney Rock was a powerful moment because it meant they had successfully crossed a large portion of the journey. Another important landmark was Scotts Bluff, a massive rock formation that stood like a natural gateway through the plains. Wagon trains passed near this towering formation as they continued toward the more difficult sections of the trail that lay ahead. Even as travelers admired these impressive landmarks, the challenges of the journey never disappeared. The land ahead gradually began changing as the wagon train moved farther west. The flat prairie slowly gave way to rolling hills and rougher terrain. These changes signaled that the settlers were slowly approaching the mountainous regions that would test their strength even more. Throughout the morning, the wagons continued their steady movement across the land. The creaking of wooden wheels mixed with the quiet sounds of footsteps and the steady breathing of the animals pulling the loads. Conversations among travelers were often brief because walking demanded concentration and energy. Despite the difficulty, there was also a sense of determination among the settlers. Every mile traveled brought them closer to the distant valleys of Oregon, where fertile land and new opportunities awaited. The dream of building new homes and communities in the West helped many travelers endure the long and exhausting days on the trail, and so, beneath the growing warmth of the morning sun, the wagon train continued forward once again, carrying hundreds of hopeful settlers deeper into the vast frontier of the American West. As the wagon train continued moving westward through the morning hours, the landscape around the travelers slowly began to change. The endless grasslands of the Central Plains were still present, but the terrain ahead showed subtle differences that experienced travelers quickly noticed. The land began rising in gentle slopes, and the horizon revealed distant hills that hinted at the far greater mountains waiting later in the journey. For settlers on the Oregon Trail, these changes in the land carried both excitement and concern. The plains had been difficult, but they were relatively open and predictable. Hills and rising ground meant more effort for the animals pulling the wagons and greater strain for the people walking beside them. As the wagon train approached these rolling areas, the oxen pulling each wagon had to work harder with every step. The heavy loads of supplies inside the wagons made climbing even gentle slopes a slow and demanding task. Sometimes, settlers walked beside the animals and encouraged them forward, guiding them carefully so the wagons would not slip backward on the uneven ground. The trail itself also became rougher in certain places. Deep grooves left by earlier wagon trains cut through the soil, sometimes forcing travelers to guide their wheels carefully to avoid damage. These ruts had been carved over many years by thousands of wagons traveling the same path toward the west. During dry weather, they formed hardened tracks in the earth, while rain could turn them into muddy trenches that trapped wheels and slowed progress. Despite these obstacles, the wagon train continued forward with steady determination. Each traveler understood that the journey required patience. The distance to Oregon was enormous, and progress could only be made 1 mile at a time. Water remained one of the most important concerns during the journey. Travelers often followed major rivers along the trail because these waterways provided both drinking water and a natural guide across the landscape. The Platte River, for example, became a familiar companion for many wagon trains during the early stages of the journey across Nebraska. The Platte River stretched wide and shallow across the plains, its slow-moving water reflecting the open sky above. Settlers sometimes described the river as a mile wide and an inch deep because its broad channel spread across a wide valley while remaining shallow in many places. Although it could still be difficult to cross, the river offered a valuable source of water for both people and animals traveling along the trail. As the wagon train moved beside the river, travelers often paused briefly to allow the oxen to drink and rest. These short stops were necessary because the animals carried the greatest burden of the journey. Without their strength, the wagons could not move, and the entire expedition would come to a halt. During these moments of rest, settlers sometimes looked across the wide plains surrounding them. The open land could appear almost endless, with tall grasses moving gently in the wind and distant hills barely visible along the horizon. For many travelers, this landscape felt both beautiful and intimidating at the same time. Wildlife occasionally appeared along the trail as well. Herds of bison could sometimes be seen grazing in the distance, their large shapes moving slowly across the prairie. These animals had once roamed the plains in enormous numbers long before wagon trains began crossing the land. Travelers also encountered smaller animals such as prairie dogs, which lived in large underground colonies scattered across the grasslands. Their high-pitched calls sometimes echoed across the prairie as the wagon trains passed nearby. Despite these brief moments of curiosity and wonder, the reality of the journey always returned quickly. The sun climbed higher into the sky, and the warmth of the day began increasing once again. Dust from the trail continued rising beneath the wagon wheels, covering travelers with the familiar layer of fine prairie soil. And so the wagon train continued its slow movement forward across the land, carrying families, supplies, and dreams of new lives toward the distant mountains that still lay far beyond the horizon. As the wagon train continued its long movement across the western plains, the afternoon hours once again began settling over the travelers. The sun climbed higher and higher above the open sky, and the warmth of the day slowly turned into the familiar heat that made the Oregon Trail so exhausting. With no tall trees or buildings to offer shade, the settlers walked beneath the full strength of the sun, while the wagons rolled slowly across the dusty path. By this point in the day, the fatigue of the journey began weighing heavily on nearly everyone in the wagon train. Travelers had already been moving since early morning, and the long hours of walking across uneven ground had begun to tire even the strongest members of the group. Yet the wagons continued forward because stopping too early would mean losing precious daylight that was needed to cover as much distance as possible. The animals pulling the wagons also felt the strain of the journey. Oxen worked steadily under the wooden yokes that rested across their shoulders, their powerful bodies leaning forward as they pulled the heavy wagons across the trail. These animals were incredibly strong, but even they required regular rest and water to continue the long journey west. When the wagon train approached small streams or rivers, the travelers often used these places as brief rest stops. The oxen were guided toward the water so they could drink, and the settlers sometimes used the opportunity to splash water on their faces and hands to cool themselves from the heat of the day. Water sources were always important along the trail, but they also carried risks. During the peak years of migration, thousands of travelers used the same rivers and streams. Waste from both people and animals sometimes contaminated these water supplies, allowing diseases such as cholera to spread quickly among wagon trains. Many travelers knew about these dangers, but there were few alternatives available on the open frontier. As the wagon train continued moving, the land around them slowly began revealing new signs that they were moving deeper into the Western Territories. The grasslands remained wide and open, but rocky outcrops and rising hills appeared more frequently along the horizon. These changes in the landscape reminded travelers that the most difficult parts of the journey still lay ahead. Far to the west stood the Rocky Mountains, a massive wall of stone that every wagon train would eventually need to cross in order to reach Oregon. The thought of those mountains often filled travelers with both excitement and concern. Reaching them meant that the wagon train had successfully crossed the long plains of the central United States. But the mountains also brought new dangers, including steep trails, narrow passes, and sudden changes in weather. For now, however, the wagon train remained on the open plains, continuing its steady march beneath the afternoon sun. Dust from the trail rose into the air with every turn of the wagon wheels, settling on the clothing and faces of the travelers who walked beside the wagons. Some settlers used walking sticks to support their tired legs, while others simply focused on placing one step in front of the other. Conversations during these hours were often quiet, because the effort of walking required concentration and energy. Occasionally, someone would glance back along the trail and see the long line of wagons stretching behind them. Each wagon carried a family that had left everything familiar behind in search of a new life far to the west. And so the wagon train continued forward mile after mile across the vast frontier, the settlers pushing through exhaustion and heat as they followed the long path of the Oregon Trail toward the distant mountains that waited beyond the horizon. As the long afternoon slowly faded toward evening once again, the wagon train continued its steady movement across the vast frontier. The sunlight began softening into warm golden colors as it stretched across the plains, casting long shadows behind the wagons rolling slowly along the trail. For the settlers walking beside those wagons, the final hours of the day were often the most difficult. Their legs were tired, their bodies covered in dust, and the long journey across the prairie had drained nearly all the strength they had left. By this point, many travelers had already walked more than 10 miles since the early morning. Their boots were worn, their clothes were heavy with sweat and dust, and the endless horizon ahead sometimes felt overwhelming. Yet the wagons continued forward, because reaching a campsite before nightfall was essential for survival on the trail. Eventually, the leader of the wagon train began searching for another place to stop. The settlers needed an area with fresh water nearby, and enough open land where the animals could graze during the night. When such a location appeared along the trail, the signal to stop slowly moved through the long line of wagons. One by one, the wagons slowed and finally came to rest. The creaking wheels stopped turning, and for a brief moment the prairie became quiet again. But just as on every other evening of the journey, the work of the settlers was far from finished. The animals were the first priority. The oxen that had pulled the wagons throughout the day needed to be unharnessed so they could rest. The heavy wooden yokes were carefully lifted from their shoulders, and the animals were guided toward nearby grass, where they could graze. Water was brought to them if a river or stream was close enough to reach. Meanwhile, other members of the wagon train began gathering materials for the evening fires. Small pieces of brush, dry grass, or buffalo chips were collected to provide fuel for cooking. Soon the small flames of many campfires appeared across the campsite, sending thin streams of smoke rising into the evening air. Dinner on the Oregon Trail remained simple and practical. Beans were cooked slowly in iron pots while bacon sizzled over the fire. Biscuits or bread were warmed beside the flames, and coffee was brewed for the tired travelers who needed comfort after the long day. Families gathered beside their wagons to share the meal together. Sitting on blankets or wooden boxes, they ate quietly while the sky slowly darkened above them. These evening meals were often the calmest moments of the day, when the hard work of travel paused for a short time. Children who had spent the day walking or riding briefly inside the wagons often grew sleepy quickly after dinner. Parents wrapped them in blankets while the fires continued glowing nearby. Around the campsite, adults spoke quietly with neighbors about the journey, discussing the miles already traveled and the long distance still ahead. Above the wagon train, the night sky slowly filled with stars. Out on the open frontier, far from cities or towns, the sky appeared enormous and bright. Travelers often looked upward in silence, seeing the vastness of the land they were crossing. And this is the reality that shows why most people today would not last a single day on the real Oregon Trail. The journey demanded constant work from sunrise until nightfall. Travelers walked for miles beside heavy wagons, endured harsh weather, faced illness and exhaustion, and slept on the ground beneath the open sky. Yet despite all these hardships, thousands of settlers continued the journey because they believed something better waited at the end of the trail. The valleys of Oregon promised fertile land, new homes, and a chance to build a future far from the struggles they had left behind. Night slowly settled over the prairie as the wagon train prepared for rest once again. The fires burned lower, the animals grazed quietly in the darkness, and the travelers lay down beside their wagons, knowing that when the sun returned in the morning, another demanding day on the Oregon Trail would begin again. And with that final quiet moment beneath the stars, the long story of a single day on the Oregon Trail gently comes to an end. If you enjoy slow, deep journeys into the past like this one, consider leaving a like and subscribing so we can continue exploring more fascinating corners of history together.